I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the horrific wave of Palestinian violence that has spread throughout the state of Israel, as well as some of the West Bank, in which Palestinians have been incited to attack Israelis on the streets of Israel. Imagine how we would feel if we learned our children or our friends had been stabbed in a mall, or while sitting at a restaurant, or walking down the street, or if they'd been run over by a car while waiting at a bus stop, or been pushed on a subway platform, or stabbed in line at the post office or at the supermarket. Not one isolated occurrence, but repeatedly, every day, seemingly everywhere, in every city and town of America. Someone was being knifed or shot, seriously wounded, mortally wounded, murdered, every day, somewhere in America. How would we feel? How frightened would we be for our children, for our friends, for ourselves? It would be terrifying. It would be paralyzing. A community would be paralyzed with fear. People wouldn't go out. People wouldn't go to the malls or the supermarkets or the movies or out on the streets. That's what's happening now in Israel. Every single day, there are new cases of individual Jews being attacked by Palestinians. Some are even Palestinian Israelis who live in Israel. And why are Palestinians now attacking Israeli Jews? Why now, over the past 2 weeks? It's because Palestinian leaders have called upon Palestinians to draw Jewish blood, to protect the Muslim right to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in the old city of Jerusalem. Palestinian leaders, imams in mosques, and the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, have charged Israel with plotting to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to take from the holy site, take that site away from Muslims, so they'll no longer be able to pray at the mosque. The president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, has incited violence and murder against Jews, as if we're living in the Middle Ages. Here's what Mahmoud Abbas said on Palestinian television.
في هذه الأيام الصعبة التي تصعد فيها إسرائيل حكومة إسرائيل الهجوم الشديد على الشعب الفلسطيني في كل مكان، وبصراحة لا ندري لذلك سببا، لأن الجانب الفلسطيني لم يعتدي ولم يقم بأي عمل ضد الإسرائيليين. إذا كانوا يعتقدون أن الناس في القدس تقف للدفاع عن نفسها فهذا حقنا. نحن يجب أن ندافع عن مقدساتنا جميعا الإسلامية والمسيحية. أما أن يفكروا بتقسيم الأقصى فهذا أمر بعيد المنال ولا يمكن أن يتحقق له.
Al-Aqsa is ours. They have no right to defile it with their filthy feet. We bless every drop of blood spilled for Jerusalem, which is clean and pure blood, blood spilled for Allah. Blood spilled for Allah. Mahmoud Abbas is calling for blood spilled for Allah, and the world says nothing in condemnation of Mahmoud Abbas. To the contrary, our own administration draws a moral equivalency between Palestinians and Israelis, talks of a cycle of violence, as if there's no difference between an act of murder and an act of self-defense. And the Secretary of State, John Kerry, who failed miserably and a peace initiative, doomed to failure because its premise was predicated on a total misunderstanding of Palestinian rejectionism. Our Secretary of State doesn't condemn Abbas and Palestinian incitement to violence for the murderous attack against Israelis. Instead, the Secretary of State talks about the settlements, an occupation, and the frustration that's built up over a lack of a two-state solution. In fact, the Secretary of State has associated the violence with what he describes as, quote, a massive increase in settlements. His actual quotes are, there's been a massive increase in settlements over the course of the last years. A massive increase in settlements? Actually, listen to the Secretary of State and how he positions the Palestinian violence.
What's happening is that unless we get going, a two-state solution could conceivably be stolen from everybody. And there's been a massive increase in settlements over the course of the last years. Now you have this violence because there's a frustration that is growing, and a frustration among Israelis who don't see any movement.
Again, the Secretary's words. There's been a massive increase in settlements over the course of the last years, as if an increase in settlements is the cause of this wave of Palestinian stabbings and murders. By the way, Aaron David Miller has a piece in the Wall Street Journal that sets the records on settlements straight. It sets the records straight. Here's the truth. Between 2009 and 2014, fewer housing units were constructed than under any of Mr. Netanyahu's recent predecessors. And Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics shows that Israel's actual settlement construction, the pace of that construction, has now reached a historical low. In fact, while the Prime Minister has concentrated on constructing inside existing settlements, Netanyahu has restrained growth beyond the West Bank security fence in areas that may become part of a future Palestinian state. In other words, there has been no massive increase in settlements over the last years. It's simply not true. And you have to wonder why a Secretary of State of the United States of America would utter that untruth. And let's be clear, no one should doubt there is frustration in the Palestinian community. There's frustration in the Jewish community as well. It would be nice, it would be wonderful if Israeli and Palestinian could live side by side. It's not even a peace. It would be wonderful just if there were an end to hostilities. If no Palestinian was firing rockets into Israeli towns and cities, if no Palestinian was stabbing or shooting an Israeli on the street, or running them down with cars and trucks, or killing them as they drive with their children. And it would be wonderful if no Israeli soldier was shooting at a Palestinian, or searching Palestinians at checkpoints, or patrolling Palestinian streets. It would be wonderful if there was virtually no armed conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and for Palestinians to be living side by side with Israelis. So of course there's frustration that a peaceful two-state solution does not exist. But for the Secretary of State to suggest it is frustration over a lack of a two-state solution, which is at the heart of the current wave of Palestinian violence and murder, reveals an appalling, an abysmal lack of understanding of any of the dynamic in the Palestinian world and of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I remain totally mystified that professional diplomats of our country can be so ignorant of the realities of the Middle East. To think that a president of the United States, that President Obama, could so miserably fail to see the truth that is blaring and glaring before him and the entire world, it's beyond belief. When Mahmoud Abbas goes on television and calls for Palestinians to spill Israeli blood to protect Israel from dividing the Al-Aqsa Mosque, what more does President Obama need to hear, to understand, to know that the responsibility lies wholly and solely with the Palestinian leadership? It is clear that this current wave of violence has been purposefully incited by the Palestinian leadership by manufacturing an Israeli assault on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is wholly untrue and is a vile and calculated manipulation of unstable Palestinians who've been incited to defend the mosque by spilling Israeli blood. It's no more complicated than that. It has nothing to do with settlements or Israeli presence on the West Bank or frustrations over a stalled peace process. And I understand our president wants to build bridges with the Muslim world. I understand the president has empathy for the Palestinian people. But this is not about the Palestinian people. This is about the president of the Palestinian Authority. This is about imams in mosques telling young Palestinians to go out and spill Jewish blood. I understand the president knows how strong and powerful Israel is, and he doesn't like Mr. Netanyahu, and he thinks Israel needs to do more for peace. But there's a transcending disease in the Palestinian world that makes all of these concerns moot and irrelevant at the present time. There is transcending hatred for Jews and the Jewish state. There's a transcending rejectionism of the legitimate right of the Jewish people to a national homeland of their own in the Middle East. There is in the Palestinian world, in the Palestinian leadership, a fundamental conviction that the Jew has no right to a state of their own in the Middle East. It's as simple as that. And all the wishful thinking for a peaceful resolution of the conflict won't make this fundamental Palestinian conviction go away. And President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry have become enablers of Palestinian rejectionism and Palestinian violence and Palestinian murder. You know, Michael Oren says that the president is neither anti-Israel nor is he anti-Semitic. You heard him say so on L'chaim. He is unequivocal. And I tend to believe him. But I also believe the president's bias toward the Muslim world, which is reflected since his earliest days in office, beginning with his speech in Cairo, when he adopted the Palestinian narrative that Israel's legitimacy is tied to the Holocaust, rather than the Jewish people's historic tie to the Jewish homeland of Eretz Yisrael. I believe the president's bias toward the Muslim world, his unwillingness to speak out against Palestinian claims that there has never been a first or second temple in Jerusalem, and his refusal to condemn Palestinian incitement and terrorism. The president's bias makes it impossible for him to shape an American foreign policy that honestly addresses the egregious and outrageous policies of the Palestinian leadership. And this includes the American administration's wholly inadequate response to the current wave of Palestinian violence that is terrifying and paralyzing the Israeli people, and which should be a source of enormous pain and concern among all Americans, Jew and non-Jew alike, but surely among American Jews. Israel is more than a profound ally of the United States. The Israeli people are family. Whether we have blood relatives in Israel or not, Jews are our family, wherever they are. And the Israeli people are our family. And we feel for them, and we care for them, and we worry about their welfare and their well-being. And we want them to live in safety and security and without fear and in peace. And it's time for Americans, Jew and non-Jew. Americans must demand that our president and the administration make clear America's commitment to Israel as the aggrieved party in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The only chance we have to create a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not peace, but peaceful resolution, is for the Palestinians to believe they have no better option. The real damage done by the American administration is that it keeps signaling to the Palestinian leadership that they have other options than a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which only means it's possible for the Palestinian leadership to reject the fact of Israel's ongoing existence as a legitimate Jewish state in the Middle East. Well, a moment ago, I read a line from Aaron David Miller's op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal. It's a superb piece entitled 4 Things That Aren't Helping the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. And joining us now on our JBS phones from Washington and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he is Vice President for New Initiatives, is one of America's leading Middle East analysts, Aaron David Miller. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us again.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Aaron, you open your op-ed piece by saying that while the worst Israeli-Palestinian violence in years continues to escalate, you say the United States is sitting on the sidelines. And you begin by criticizing Secretary of State Kerry for his statement linking the violence to settlements, saying that the Secretary, quote, legitimizes Palestinian motives. Aaron, why would the Secretary of State make such a serious mistake?
Well, I think the Secretary's frustrated. I think he's an analyst as well as an advocate of Israeli-Palestinian peace. Look, there's no doubt that settlement activity on the Israeli side constitutes, of all the things the Israelis do, in terms of their own behavior and contribution toward the absence of a solution, settlement activity is probably the greatest. And that's not to say that there aren't major transgressions on the part of the Palestinians, including acquiescence in terror and violence and incitement. But the reality is, even if that were to be the case, even if this round was directly linked to massive settlement expansion, which I think is factually inaccurate. I think, in fact, if you look at the data from the Israeli Ministry of Housing, what you find is that Netanyahu, per year, has built fewer housing units than any of his recent predecessors. Even if it were true that the settlement issue was the primary cause, if, in fact, you say that, then you essentially create justification and a kind of, I don't think the Secretary did it intentionally, endorsement for Palestinians to take action, because the Israeli settlement activity is not going to stop. And second, you feed, I think, the adversaries of the Prime Minister, whose slogan is punish and settle. They would like the Prime Minister, elements within Likud, to be much tougher on Palestinian perpetrators and to demonstrate Israeli resolve by intensification of settlement activity in the Jerusalem area and in the West Bank. Second, 80% of these attacks are not coming from the West Bank.
Right.
80% are coming from young Palestinians with Israeli identity cards, not citizens, who live in Jerusalem and who have access to Israel proper and freedom of movement. So the notion somehow that this is linked to an intensification of settlement activity is just not true. It has many different causes and sources. Frustration, the absence of any kind of meaningful negotiation. By the way, not that I'm recommending one, because I think if you tried to get Bibi Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas back to the negotiating table, it would end up in an abject failure. Mm-hmm. But this wave of violence has to be seen in the context of at least a half century of periods of accommodation, even agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, and a reversion and default to violence, confrontation, and terror. And it is driven in large part, this particular round, by proximity. It was Ben Franklin who said, I think, that proximity breeds children and contempt. And the reality is Israelis and Palestinians are inextricably linked together, in some cases meters apart. So when you put all of this into the hopper, what comes out is this new and apparently spontaneous tactic of low-tech terror.
Yes.
It's hard to predict because most of these perpetrators do not have security profiles. It's hard to preempt without saturating the ground with Israeli police and much larger numbers of the IDF. And it's going to continue until, I suspect, this round between Israeli security precautions and preemption and continued Israeli-Palestinian efforts, which is the good news, that security cooperation to prevent an escalation continues. This will continue until it peters out, and then some new phase or new round of escalation at some point is going to occur.
Okay.
So it's impossible to look at this in isolation.
Yes.
It is not the first intifada, 87 to 1991 or 2. It's not the second intifada, 2000 to 2004. It doesn't resemble any of the three confrontations between Israel and Hamas, nor does it resemble the confrontations between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. It is right now, frankly, a Jerusalem problem with spillover, worrisome spillover, to Palestinian citizens of Israel, Arab Israelis, Israeli Arabs, however you want to define them, as well. And it is, if there were any root cause or any trigger, I would think it is the rather volatile problem of the Haram Sharif, Har Habayit.
Okay, I want
to overlapping sacred space.
I understand.
Two mosques holy to Islam sits on top of the remains of both the first and second temples, and the perceived changes that have occurred in the rules of the game up there, which have led to wild conspiracy theories on the part of the Palestinians.
Right.
That the Israelis are interested in fundamentally dividing up the Haram, building the third temple. And by the way, part of this problem has to do with permissive rabbinic figures who have pronounced over the last several years that it is okay for Israeli Jews to go to the Temple Mount and to pray. And non-Muslim prayer has been restricted by successive Israeli governments quite effectively for a very long time. But it has now created this image that the government of Israel, which is certainly not the case, wants to turn the Temple Mount into a large synagogue, which and frankly is
okay. And it's not the case.
It's dangerously
I
silly.
understand. I want to understand, though, from your perspective. We see and we hear. We see it, Aaron, the way in which the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, is inciting violence against Jews, the spilling of blood. I don't understand why the President of the United States and the Secretary of State is not holding Mahmoud Abbas responsible for inciting Arab violence against Jews over what you now say is a manufactured issue of Islamic freedom at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Why is our administration not making an issue here?
Look, as long as, first of all, I don't think anybody takes Mahmoud Abbas seriously, number one.
Do the Palestinians take him seriously?
Most of the incitement, the direct calls for attacks, is being driven in large measure by Islamic Jihad and Hamas media. Abbas, I think, frankly, in this particular situation, is largely irrelevant. What he says, what he does, I'm not sure most Palestinians pay much attention to. And the good news about this situation, if you read people like Amos Harel and the other Israeli reporters who cover the Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation, is that is continuing to function. You don't have large-scale and sustained demonstrations right now on the West Bank. You don't have massive and intensive attacks against Israeli settlers. You don't have large demonstrations and crowds forming in which live fire is being used. All of these things are a testament to the practical nature of Israeli and Palestinian security cooperation. And I think that, and I, under no circumstances, I'd have to take a look at, and you'd have to identify. I understand Abbas talked the other day about Israelis killing Palestinians in cold blood, but you'd have to literally identify statements attributed to the president of the Palestinian Authority that constitute what you would consider, and I would consider, blatant incitement. And what I mean by that is calls to violence. Calls to violence. The problem, I think, is that the kind of violence that is taking place, which is very low tech, knives are easily accessible anywhere, so are rocks. And I'm not sure that, and I think this is wrong-headed, I think there's an argument that could be made that Palestinian officials somehow separate what they consider popular resistance like that from what they would consider more blatant terror attacks, using weapons, firearms, and suicide terror bombs. And I think that that's part of the problem for a guy like Abbas. He is simply incapable of condemning the kind of spontaneous, unorganized rage of these young people in Jerusalem. And I think that's wrong, but I think it's going to be very difficult to get a consistent and positive media message out of the Palestinian Authority under these circumstances.
Aaron, as always, I appreciate a few moments of your time and analysis. Thank you very, very much. Aaron David Miller, Vice President for New Initiatives at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. On our phones now, we have here in New York the Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, Malcolm Hoenelin. Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us.
It's always my pleasure.
I know you're very busy and it's very hectic for you these days. And, in fact, I just want to start there. What do you hear from Israelis at the moment as they must deal with this, this wave of terror day in and day out?
Look, I think that Israelis across the board are united today. They are deeply concerned because of the different nature of the conflict that confronts them today, that this is not an organized, centralized effort, but a multi-headed, more spontaneous violence that can arise anywhere, be executed anywhere, can come from inspiration on the internet, which as much as it is a blessing, can be a curse, and it becomes a vehicle for good, but it's certainly a vehicle for bad. And imams and those who are trying to incite to violence use it to great effect. So there's no real way to know. And once you have to be suspect of everybody around you, because it's hard often to distinguish who's an Arab, who's a Jew, it puts people in a very uncomfortable position. It's a position they don't want to be in. And when people, are in this state of fear, it's very detrimental. They know that these are isolated attacks, and that the likelihood is that people will not be victims, but everybody is on alert now.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really the thing I hear most often from people, and questioning about when will this end? How can it end? Who can put a stop to it? The Palestinian leadership who inspired this, and I think it's very important to make the point, this is not territorial, and despite even statements by American officials, let alone UN people, it has nothing to do with settlements. You can talk about it in the broader context of the tensions between Palestinians and Israelis. This was initiated, incited by Abbas, and the charges about Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, being under siege, where he said the temples didn't exist and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is theirs as well. So it's a denial of Christianity, of Judaism, the Judeo-Christian heritage and history. But telling people, especially young people, arousing them, saying to come and defend Al-Aqsa, when in fact there was no siege, there was no change in the status quo, there were no differences from the past. The only difference is the Jews were more restricted, not less, not the Arabs.
That's right.
So it's very important that people understand what the core of this is, and he's turning it into a religious fight, which is far more dangerous, far more incendiary, and that it's a genie that you cannot put back in the bottle once you unleash it. And given the climate in the region with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all of whom use radical religious ideologies as one of their tools and carry it to the extremes of beheadings and now knifings in Israel, stones are deadly. These are not rock throwers. They're throwing boulders that kill and have killed. But going in the streets and carrying a knife after they see, the ISIS people, cutting off heads, is very frightening to people.
Yes. But the emails I've received from Israelis are that people are scared to leave their home. It's interesting. I would imagine if you live in a small town or even a mid-sized town, for all I know, even in New York, and some child was attacked in a mall, was stabbed in a mall, in some towns the malls would be empty the next day. So I appreciate how frightening this can be, especially when, Malcolm, it's multiple times, day in and day out. You talk about the incitement of Mahmoud Abbas, and we just spoke with Aaron David Miller, and I was sort of taken by surprise. He wrote a very good piece in the Wall Street Journal criticizing Secretary of State Kerry. But when I pressed him on the issue of whether Mahmoud Abbas should be held responsible, and one of the things that bothers me, Malcolm, is that I don't hear our president or our Secretary of State criticizing Abbas for the level of incitement, public television incitement. It bothers me. I was surprised that Aaron David Miller seemed to try to poo-poo that. Now you've used that as the centerpiece. Why do you think it is that the administration, neither the president nor the State Department, has come out in unequivocal terms, not simply condemning the acts, but condemning the leadership of the Palestinian community, which, as you say, is inciting this violence at the present time?
And it's interesting that Abbas today urged Israel to arrest inciting officials, when if you look at who's engaging in incitement, it's Arab members of the Knesset who do things that would never be tolerated here or anywhere else. I mean, things that really come to the level of undermining the state, of being treasonous in their nature. And I think that there is a hesitancy always about Abbas because they always say he's better than the alternative, and they're afraid of undermining him, and that he is weak. Well, at some point, he's not better than the alternative, and that there has to be some time when he's held to account, when we're giving hundreds of millions of dollars every year to the Palestinian Authority, to him, to use in the corrupt way he is by giving subsidies, monthly subsidies, to every terrorist who kills Israelis or wounds Israelis, who engages in these outrageous acts. He pays them a monthly stipend. He pays their families. It sends the message of endorsement, of encouragement that somebody who engage in these acts knows that they will all be taken care of. And that nobody holds them to account. And they say, well, it's not directly. We give the money to other things, but it's all fungible. So if you give money for some other project that he wants, he diverts those funds towards this. And it amounts to many, many millions of dollars. That's only one of the many characteristics. The fact that Palestinian media, the fact that he personally engaged in this, the distortions and lies about the Temple Mount, and now most recently about a death of a child, the 13-year-old, who stabbed a 13-year-old on a bicycle and then himself was shot and is alive in a hospital. There are videos showing him that he's alive, and yet he held up his picture yesterday and said he was dead, killed, martyred by the Israelis. I mean, it's outrageous, and he knows it's a lie. Mm-hmm. And yet everybody covers for him because they say, oh, he's weak. Look, he's not an elected president anymore, and he has misled his people. He has taken them down a path of destruction. He doesn't want to face an electorate. He's afraid of Hamas. He plays all the games. He goes into the UN and does things to undermine Israel, goes to the World Court, to the International Court, Criminal Court. He does all of these things, and yet Israel gets blamed when Netanyahu constantly says, I'm ready to meet with Abbas now, today. He says, we're ready to negotiate. I'm ready to sit down if he wants to, and he won't. Why should he? Because the world is giving him everything he wants, gives him a buy on everything. And why won't our Secretary of State, other officials, the UN, come out and say to him, it's over. No more honeymoon.
Right.
You have to stand up and be a leader and do it for your people. Don't do it for the Israelis. And it's up to Israel today to say no more tolerance of this. When kids engage in these acts of violence and terrorism, hold the parents accountable. Take them to court. Make them pay a price for it. They will rein in their kids. We've shown in the past, and Abbas has shown that when he wants to control the street, maybe not completely, and maybe less so today, but because of his own efforts at division and dividing the people and his inability to have a real authority. But still, when he wants to clear the streets, he knows how to. And that's really, everybody has to be held to account today. And when, the Secretary of State made the reference to settlements, it's just simply not so. And that gives them, you take them off the hook. The Abbas and all of his minions are taken off the hook because they say, well, it's not them, it's because of settlements.
Okay, so I know you saw my conversation with Michael Oren, yes. And I sort of asked him the same question. I'm going to ask you one more time. I don't know if you have an answer, but even the fact that I can ask the question is important. Is it that the American administration doesn't understand it, or they do understand it, but for some reason they can't come out and criticize Mahmoud Abbas because, as you say, they feel he's too weak? What worries me, Malcolm, is that it's not simply that they're trying to protect Abbas. I worry profoundly now that there is no understanding of what seems to be so clear and self-evident about A, Palestinian incitement, and B, Palestinian rejectionism, and that ultimately there can be no peace in any way until, as you heard Michael Oren say to me, Palestinians must be willing to recognize a legitimate Jewish state, and they can't do it. And if the president doesn't understand that they are unwilling to, either they can't or they won't, then we're in real trouble. And we're at the moment of we're in the presidential election cycle. It seems to me, Malcolm, that this is an opportunity for American Jewry to sort of say to whoever is going to be the next president, one of the things we need from you is a clear, unequivocal statement that America now supports the state of Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and until the Palestinians are willing to give up rejectionism and accept a legitimate Jewish state in the Middle East, the Palestinians cannot expect the kind of economic and diplomatic support that have been coming from the state of Israel. Now, that's a statement on my part, but I want to know from you, to what extent does it resonate with you? To what extent is this realistic? What do you expect we can, and what do you want us to do?
So there are a few questions there. First of all, I agree completely with the premise and your description of the situation. I think that the facts speak louder than anything we can say about what has been happening around, what the role is, and how we have failed to address it. And I think we would strengthen his hand, Abbas's hand, were we to confront him, that he has to go to the people and say, listen, we're going to pay a heavy price.
Absolutely.
I don't believe that the majority of the Palestinian people want this. The vast majority don't want it. This is not a popular uprising like the Intifada. But they also have to take action. And you have the mayor of Nazareth, an Israeli Arab mayor, who courageously goes out front. You've had others who went on the Internet at the same time that we see other Internet sites teaching people how to stab and where to stab, and multiple manifestations in the Internet of excitement and exhorting to extreme violence and calling on young people to take to the stage. And I think we should be holding, Facebook and others to account as well when they allow pages that incite and educate to terrorism and violence. But I think here, what we're facing is a manifestation that is global in a sense, that we see throughout the Middle East, that beheading becomes the major recruitment tool, that tens of thousands of young people have come to the ISIS flag from all over Europe. They're not lower class in many cases. They're middle class. Some are educated. Look at some of the people who carried out these attacks against the Israelis. You have a guy who works in Exec in the electric company. You had others who are in schools, and they're not coming from downtrodden poor families. That many of them are coming from middle class situations. Many of them are young people who are just who are in schools, and yet they feel that this is a legitimate expression, or have been exhorted to believe it, and that to believe that they will become martyrs, and the parents then hold ceremonies after their kids are killed, saying how that they're proud of them and that they're shaheeds, and they hold up flags and hold big ceremonies, celebrations, when their child died. For what? For nothing. For nothing. Mm-hmm. So that everybody, the societal factors, the communal factors have to be activated. The religious leaders, others have to say, stop it. This is crazy. You're killing your kids for nothing. You're killing other people's children for nothing. Who gains from it? And all you do is tell the people of Israel, listen, these are not partners for peace. This is not people you can sit down with. If they can walk into a mall and walk into other places, and we started off, and I wanted to mention that one of the things we all have to do is to make sure that nobody cancels trips, that that people should buy online from Israeli companies, that we should show that we are with the people of Israel now. And if you can't be there physically now, plan a trip for a month from now. And if we have the Sabbath of Solidarity this weekend, where Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionists, all the rabbinic and synagogal groups came together to declare it. So American Jewry is united behind Israel. We have to show them that. You have to call your friends in Israel. We have to find every way, and also to let our elected officials know exactly what you said. We want to hear from them that this is a time when they have to stand with Israel, that they have to make it manifest, that in the Democratic debate, nobody even mentioned Israel except a passing reference by Webb. Well, you have this situation going on, and our closest and best ally, as he described it, and it's not a factor. Foreign policy generally is not a factor when the world is in turmoil. So we have to focus attention. People have to make their voices heard. And it can't be a partisan issue. It's not Democrats, not Republicans. Everybody has to recognize what's at stake today. The stakes are higher and long-term. And in a time when people are either indifferent, when the media so distorts and so misrepresents what is happening, Israelis write and say, we see the stories, and has no correlation. What's happening around? The New York Times writes a headline, 6 Palestinians killed. Do they say they were involved in terrorism? Did they try to break through the border? Do they tell the story? No, because the headline is all that anybody reads. Mm-hmm. And it's a really sad time in that regard.
It is a very sad time, Malcolm. There is in Israel now some feeling that there should be a harsher crackdown on a certain kind of subversive speech and subversive action. And it's been amazing to me that the State of Israel has tolerated the kind of rhetoric that comes out of, for example, the Arab Joint Party that is in the Knesset. Many people don't know, Malcolm, that Arab Israelis have the right to vote. Not only do they have the right to vote, they have their own party. Not only do they have their own party, they have their own parties, which represents a significant block of seats in the Israeli Knesset, but that this bloc is constantly agitating for the destruction of the State of Israel. And there are some people now who are suggesting that Israel should, in this period of time, in some way, I guess, take a step back on what we would call here in America the larger sense of civil rights. And there's some real concern that either the State of Israel must to protect itself, or perhaps it will take a step in the wrong direction if it begins to clamp down on a certain kind of free speech even for Arab Israelis in the State of Israel. Are you concerned at all about where the direction this may take in the State of Israel?
Look, there are always opportunities for excessive reaction. We have issued statements, condemning the violence and Abbas's role, et cetera. But we also say Israelis can't take the law into their own hands. You have to reinforce what law enforcement, what others do. Israelis can carry guns, then if they do it under the proper rules and restrictions. But they can't take the law. Can't just have people going out and shooting, Arabs or enforcing the law on their own. Law enforcement has to do a better job to be present, and that's why the presence now, the troops, the checking points, other things, are all necessary to avoid perhaps that kind of a breakdown of civil order. But I think that the what we're talking about in terms of the Arab members of the Knesset, a few of them who go to the Temple Mount and incite and say that legitimates some of the attacks and talk about the siege, which obviously they're there, they know it's not true, and attack the right of Jewish members of parliament to go there while they're there. And this is not freedom of speech. This is yelling fire in a crowded theater.
Yes.
Israel should not jeopardize the freedoms and rights that it accords all of its citizens, and it doesn't. I think it protects them at an extreme length to assure that the Arab citizens, Christian citizens, Muslim citizens, Jews have their rights. There have to be, in times of a conflict like this and at times of violence like this, sure that there are restrictions placed on people. Every country in the world places restrictions. We had clampdowns. We had neighborhoods under lockdown. You have situations like that arise everywhere in the world in democracies because you're trying to protect law and order. You're trying to see that society doesn't break down. So I think that civil rights have to be protected. I think that we have to see the government exercise its role, its leadership. I think that sometimes they were too tolerant. As you know, we've talked about the Mount of Olives and the throwing of stones, and have said that on your show that this will escalate if it's not dealt with. It spreads, and it spreads then to the light railroad, and it spreads to Jerusalem. And they have to see that there will be a price, and that there has to be a consequence for people who are caught and should be brought to justice and jailed. And as I said, when there are minors involved, hold the parents accountable. See to it that it's not collective punishment. Israel has avoided that. But there has to be some collective responsibility to put an end to this violence.
All right, I want you to speak one more time, very briefly, to the two issues that have been the theme here. One is that we did have an administration which tried to make this look as if, Israel, the victim was really the perpetrator, that basically this was because settlements were being built. There was this comment that there was a massive increase. That's the phrase that the Secretary of State used, a massive increase in settlement construction, and therefore there is frustration that has led to this violence, which is utter nonsense. And then, as you point out, there are headlines in newspapers all across America which begin with how Palestinians have either been injured or killed, or when the story is about what these Palestinians have done. My question for you as we sum up is, what can we, American Jews, do now when we see, the frustration is ours, when it's so frustrating to see in which the way the American administration and the American media has spun this in a way that has no basis in reality and makes Israel once again the bad guy. What can we do, Malcolm?
Well, I think there are many things that we can do. First, I want to be clear that in the same day that the Secretary made that statement up in Boston, the White House spokesman and the State Department spokesman, who had been pressed the day before by Mike Lee of Reuters, and saying and kept pressing him about what he was saying on ascribing responsibility and not addressing incitement, not addressing these other things. They did issue a statement, including about incitement, condemning incitement and condemning the death of Israelis. But then it always ends up with this: both sides must.
Right.
Israel didn't initiate this. Israel doesn't want to continue this.
Right.
You can't have moral equivalency.
Right.
You've got to say, this is the arsonist, this is the firefighter,
Right.
this is the criminal, this is the policeman. You got to make the distinction. And if you don't say it, and if you don't call it as it is, you're only going to give license to it continuing. So the media has a responsibility here, and I would say that by and large they have not lived up to it. I listen to these NPR accounts. They make you sick. It's so distorted, and they have interviews with the mothers of the victims extensively, and some reference to an Israeli that got killed. But it's no balance, and they don't talk about the kind of actions that they were engaged in, what has really happened, and how restrained Israel's response was and is today. Look, Israel could send in massive numbers of troops, clamp down on every Arab village, put a stop to it. But there are citizens in Israel, there are people who live in the territories. They are not being held. They have much more freedom today than Israelis, because Israelis are the ones who have to be afraid. Arabs aren't walking in the streets by and large afraid that they're going to be attacked. And I think that the message, and we have to hold the media accountable. People have to call the stations and call the newspapers and write letters to the editor and make their voices heard. Let your elected officials know. We expect them to speak out. We expect them to tell the truth. And we're not asking them to varnish. We're not asking them to color over anything that they about Israel. Tell the truth. Tell the truth. Mm-hmm. What would America do in a similar circumstance? Mm-hmm. What happens when we have rioting in our streets? What happens when we have civil disruptions? And this is not civil disobedience. This is out-and-out violence, people being stabbed, young people killed. This is outrageous. And we have to make our indignation known and let them know we expect to hear from them. Exactly. And if we don't, we will remember it.
Yes.
This is a critical moment, and we want to hear from them.
Malcolm, I'm so appreciative of your comments, and I love you so much. What you're doing is extraordinary. I've said it over and over again. I will never tire of saying it. And I thank you so much for spending time with us here on JBS. Thank you, Malcolm.
Always my pleasure, and thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Be well. Malcolm Hoenelin, Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, and he tells it like it is. And in essence, this is the charge now that American Jews have. We must let our American elected officials know this is an American presidential season. This is a time when Jews should be saying to any candidate they're considering supporting, you want our support? Then there's one thing we must be absolutely sure of. When you are in office, you will not play the game that has been played by the Obama administration. You will be unequivocal in your support of Israel when it comes to the violence directed at Israelis. And when it comes to Palestinian rejectionism that basically says we will never accept the legitimate Jewish state of Israel in the Middle East. And as long as that's the position of Palestinian leadership, then there can be no two-state solution, there can be no peaceful resolution. And anybody who doesn't understand that is either deluding themselves or, for reasons of their own, are not telling the truth. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland. Wonderful job, Sloan. Production coordinator, Serge Goldberg. Fabulous job, Serge. To the associate director of JBS, Dara Golub. And, of course, to our producers on this edition of In the News, to Carol Lilienthal and to Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.